Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Danny Sigwalt and I'm the co-executive director of PowerShift Network, and I'm so excited that you're joining us for this kickoff webinar conversation about climate change and state violence. At the top of the summer, I came to a realization with a bunch of our coworkers that it was really important that we dig in heavy to the ways in which the current social ills that we're seeing that impact our lives are really interrelated, and that there are systems in place that create really clear ties between climate justice and other issues of state violence that the state perpetuates and refuses to address that all feed into one another. So we're really excited that you're joining us tonight. I'm so excited to see this brainchild of mine becoming a reality. We had so many folks register, and I'm so excited about this series moving forward. And I'm super grateful to Laura and Elsa, who will introduce themselves soon, for joining us for this inaugural conversation. The structure of this series is going to be around featuring an expert on a topic related to state violence. Today it's militarism. Next month we're going to have a conversation about U.S. immigration system. We're going to have conversations about labor, about white nationalism, and more to come, and the ways that they impact and intersect with our movement to fight for a more stable climate and also achieve real climate resiliency and community-focused solutions to the climate crisis. This series is being hosted by PowerShift Network, which is the organization that I am one of two co-executive directors of. And PowerShift Network is a network of 90+ organizations that are all committed to drilling down and supporting youth power in building a better world through fighting for climate justice. We provide education, resources, training, mentorship, connections, and more to young people across the country who are organizing and learning how to be stronger advocates and activists for this better world and for a truer justice. Today, our topic, as you know, is about climate change and US militarism. We're really excited to start this conversation series with this topic because it's one that has such clear connections. We all understand that the climate crisis is really emboldened by the US military system. The US military is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet, and also in a lot of ways exists to protect fossil fuel infrastructure across the globe. With that, I'm really, really excited and grateful to introduce Laura, who is a PowerShift alum, meaning she came to one of our convergences back in the day and now works at National Priorities Project to sit in this expert role and tell us more about this issue. She's going to offer a couple of minutes of a presentation. Then Elsa from Generation Green, one of our beloved youth activists, is going to offer a framework for thinking about how this issue intersects with climate justice and our climate justice advocacy and activist work. And I'm going to participate in that conversation to really figure out where the connections are, what the lessons that we can learn from really deepening our understanding of the US military, and also how we can be better activists, allies, and co-conspirators in the movement to reduce the US military spending and achieve climate justice. Solidarity is key across all of our movements, and the ultimate goal of our series is to make sure that folks have the resources that they need to be strong advocates for various issues related to state violence and combating state violence in supporting their climate justice work. So with that, I'll pass the mic over to Laura to introduce herself briefly and then start her presentation. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm so excited to have so many folks in the room, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Yeah, so I will use this opportunity to introduce myself, which is supposed to happen after Laura's presentation. I the first protest that I ever went to in 2003 was what was then the biggest global mobilization in theoretically human history. It was the global mobilization in resistance to the pending war in Iraq under G.W. Bush. And since then, my activism has really moved around in a lot of ways around issue areas. But my first activist home in a lot of ways was at a small anti-war organization that was based in DC. And it really drilled down for me in a lot of ways the connections between militarism and wild, out of control spending, and the fact that our governments aren't able to fund human needs here at home, right? Thinking about homelessness, thinking about education and our school systems, they're just not sufficiently funded, right? Like, we're not sufficiently funding human needs here at home, let alone thinking about like the exorbitant wealth that could be distributed across the globe, because there's so many financial interests in the military in the US. I have always been really committed to racial justice, and that has always been kind of my political ideological framework in this work. And moving from militarism and the war machine and fighting the war machine to thinking about climate change felt like a really logical connection in a lot of ways. One of the really transformative experiences that I had was around Hurricane Katrina in 2006, watching folks get really criminalized, watching people from my community that I identified with, right, like Black folks in a Black city like DC is, but in New Orleans, being criminalized for trying to survive, and looking at the ways that the National Guard, like the cops, killed people who were really trying to survive. I'm seeing that Laura's ready. I'm gonna just close up. I'm really excited about this conversation because the connections between our lack of ability as a country to meaningfully address a lot of social ills has to do with a lot with the amount of money that's being poured into our military. And also, I understand in a lot of ways that the military is really supporting and reproducing systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. Laura's going to talk about this. I'm prayerful, as my mother-in-law would say, that this is gonna work. Let's see how you sound.
How's it sound?
So
okay.
Good. So good.
Incredible. Okay, thanks everybody. Okay, let's try again. I will share my screen. I'm doing the dorky thing where I narrate that. Incredible. Okay, thanks for your patience, everybody. I think I was just in the middle of introducing myself. I'm Laura, as you hopefully know by now. I use she, her pronouns. I work with the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, and we produce research and analysis on the federal budget and on military spending. And at NPP, my work in particular revolves around identifying links between militarism and climate change, so that we can shift the war economy to address the climate crisis. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So thanks for joining. So I'd like to start off by framing our discussion today within the context of the Just Transition framework. And for those of you who can't see the screen, we have a sort of graphic that illustrates a transition from the extractive economy we have now to the living economy that we want. And I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this framework. For those of you who aren't, this graphic illustrates essentially the process of transforming the extractive economy that we have now that exploits people and harms the planet to a living economy that really creates the conditions for healthy, thriving communities and ecosystems. And if you're able to see the graphic, hopefully you can identify that militarism is the governance mechanism in the extractive economy. And what that really means is that militarism is the coercive arm of the economy. So in other words, it's violence that keeps an economy that isn't meeting people's needs, that's wrecking the planet, in operation. And people have always resisted the exploitation of the extractive economy, but it's violence and it's the threat of violence that really keep it going. And this plays out on a global scale. We see the military yielding this power internationally. We see militarized police employ brute force against communities within the United States, and militarized immigration enforcement violently patrolling national borders and beyond and within the so-called homeland. And so when we really sort of understand the role of militarism within this extractive economy that we know we need to change and transform, it's clear that if we don't divest from militarism, we really can't build the kind of economy that we need to fight climate change and just to live well. So I just kind of wanted to start us off there. So one of the major ways that U.S. militarism fuels the climate crisis is emissions. The Pentagon is a major polluter. And on this slide, we have, a U.S. tank sort of extending its arms across the globe and stretching into oil wells around the world. And the U.S. military has really extensive infrastructure and operations both domestically and abroad. The United States has over 800 foreign or around 800 foreign military bases in more than 70 countries around the world. Here's a map of all of those bases across the globe. And that's a really massive military infrastructure. So if we put that into perspective, the next country on the list has less than 20 bases. And so once we get a sense of the scope of U.S. militarism, it may not come as a surprise that, as Danny was saying at the beginning, the largest industrial military in the history of the world is also among the biggest polluters. The Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional producer of greenhouse gases in the world, and it produces about as much greenhouse gases in any given year as entire industrialized countries do. So about the same amount of emissions in a year as countries like Denmark or Sweden. Beyond the actual literal carbon emissions produced by U.S. military operations, extractive industries, including the fossil fuel industry, really rely on militarization to uphold operations around the globe. So we see here a land defender or a water protector standing up to protect their land and being faced with military suppression. The United States has a really well-known history of fighting wars for oil. The vast military infrastructure that's situated around the world that we just saw on the map a few slides back is often strategically positioned in resource-rich regions. And oil is the leading cause of war, and it accounts for roughly half of interstate wars in recent decades. And so a large part of the hundreds of billions of dollars that is spent on the Pentagon every year, and I'll talk more about that in a second, goes towards, quote unquote, defending the world's oil supply. Meanwhile, those who fight to protect their land, to resist the oppressive practices of the extractive economy, are often met with state and paramilitary violence. And we know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately targeted by this militarized violence. And these populations are increasingly characterized as eco-terrorists. And so we see sort of the same language used to justify war and military aggression abroad used to target those who resist the domination and the exploitation of the fossil fuel economy here in the United States. And this takes place all around the globe as well. And militarized policing, the militarized repression of those protests by policing is directly linked to the military. So the military-grade equipment that perhaps you've seen in the streets by, among police in recent months and years is acquired by local police through a Department of Defense program called the 1033 program. And the way that program functions is it basically gives riot gear, weaponized vehicles, and other military equipment to local police. And in recent years, we've actually seen that since Standing Rock, there's been an increase in so-called critical infrastructure protection laws, is what they're called. And these are laws that essentially target protest movements and attempt to sort of muzzle opposition to the construction of oil and gas pipelines or other forms of fossil fuel infrastructure. It's also worth noting that recent reporting has revealed that police foundations across the United States regularly receive funding from oil and gas companies, private utilities, and financial institutions. And so the role of state violence and militarism has played in perpetuating and upholding systems that have caused the climate crisis are pretty clear. I want to touch briefly on the ways that climate change and border militarization are linked. I'm going to sort of brush past this topic a little bit because, as Danny said, there's a whole another upcoming conversation devoted entirely to this topic that you should definitely tune into. But I want to touch on it a little bit because it is an important part of this puzzle. We know that there will be massive waves of migration because of climate change, and this is already happening. But Pentagon reports going back decades publicly acknowledge not only the existence of climate change, but also document plans to advance a militarized response to the conditions of a climate changed world. And militarizing borders is a big part of that response. And this follows kind of a long history of federal government understanding human rights issues and social problems as security issues, and therefore putting forth militarized responses, right? So in the case of climate change, this tendency has misdirected resources away from the programs that we actually need to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and instead it's sort of contributed to this ever-growing massive military budget. But we kind of like know this shtick, right? Like proposals to meaningfully address the climate crisis are often not taken seriously. They're characterized as unrealistic pipe dreams. There's the sort of infamous green dream or whatever quote. You know, how are you going to pay for it is like the very tired response to very serious proposals to avoid climate chaos. But we also know that the same scrutiny is almost never applied to the military. And, you know, politicians across parties come together year after year to approve massive military expenditures in the United States, often with very little discussion. And so, unfortunately, a massive military budget is an issue of bipartisan consensus at this point. And this illustration kind of illustrates that, right? Like we have a huge pot of money for the military and other things that we really need, like in this moment, public health funding, renewable energy funding, monies for refugees resettling because of the impact of climate change, like those are getting pennies by comparison. So here's a federal, a pie chart that breaks down the federal discretionary budget, and that's the budget that Congress allocates every year. And that's how the Department of Defense is budgeted. And as you can see, or maybe you can't see, and I'll tell you, we are now spending over $700 billion every year on the military, and that's over half of the entire federal discretionary budget. So that's a huge portion of our federal resources. By comparison, you know, the military budget in 2020 was 272 times larger than the federal budget for energy efficiency and renewable energy. You can kind of see it's just sort of a sliver in this pie chart compared to the Department of Defense budget. And that really adds up over time. So we've spent $6.4 trillion on war in the past 2 decades, on U.S. wars since September 11th, 2001. That's a massive number. It's kind of hard to conceptualize, but by comparison, the cost to decarbonize the U.S. power grid is estimated to be $4.5 trillion. So when you put those 2 numbers up next to each other, we see that instead of funding endless wars, we could have totally transformed our entire energy grid by now and had like literally trillions of dollars left over, which is a massive amount of money and resources. So before we sort of open it up to a broader discussion, I know that's all very grim that I've just outlined, but it's not all grim because we actually have a lot of movement power to change things. And right now we see that military spending is justified as, you know, necessary for our safety and our protection. But right now it's pretty clear that war and militarism are actually diverting resources away from things that we need to actually keep us safe, whether that's solutions to the climate crisis or public health infrastructure in the face of COVID-19. but it doesn't have to be this way, and we do have the power to shift budget priorities. And I think something I want us all to think about is how that fits into this broader project that Black-led movements and other movements are already leading to reconceptualize what safety and security really means for communities. And when we do that, we can invest in new forms of international solidarity and cooperation and reparations to develop global solutions to global problems like the climate crisis. So there's hope. I'm gonna go out of this and open it up. We're gonna talk about it. I think, are you muted?
I am muted. I'm also trying to make it look pretty. I needed to do that. Hey, Elsa. Thanks for being with us tonight. Let's start off by offering you an opportunity to introduce yourself and then also let us know what really resonates with you in terms of thinking about the way that your climate activism intersects with this struggle to reduce military spending in the States.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited. Like Danny said, and obviously my name is Elsa Mengistu. I am a climate justice organizer and an advocate. I kind of got into climate justice, environmentalism on accident. This was never something that I was like, I'm gonna be an environmentalist. I'm gonna be part of this movement. But one day I came across a group of kids and they were talking about climate change, but not in a way that I had seen it often. And they were talking about climate change through the lens of humanity and how communities are being impacted by this crisis and how this crisis overlaps with every other crisis that exists, not only in this country, but globally. And so for the first time, I was like, okay, they're speaking facts. Like they're speaking in language that I can understand. They're not just talking about data, they're actually talking about people, because I'm an organizer and I didn't want to focus on like nature. I didn't want to focus on conservation. Like that's not my focus. That's critical, but that's not where my focus is. That's not where my people are. And so I was like, okay, this is really cool. I'm going to do this for a while. And then through that, I just kind of got the tools and the language and just things just kind of like broadened in my mind. And I realized like everything is interconnected. There's nothing on this earth that's not connected to something else on this earth. And so the way that we build and the way that we respond to these issues has to represent that. It has to be holistic of that. Otherwise, we're skipping over so much of things that we can't even solve it. And so with that framework, I kind of bounced around from place to place trying to figure out like what exactly is my purpose. And at this time I was transitioning into like my first semester of college at Howard University. And I was realizing that I want to focus on Black women. I want to focus on Black youth. Like that is where my focus is. Those are the bridges that I work in. And I don't know if I can do that in the environmental space. I don't know if that can coexist. And so for a while, I kind of had to like really think like, I don't know, man, like, can this work out? And then I came to the conclusion that it can and it will, and it is, because they are the same issues. And so I got connected to some really amazing people at Howard University and across the country. And we kind of formed an organization called Generation Green. And Generation Green is an intergenerational Black-led environmental organization. And in this organization, we don't talk about the environment through the lens of just physical environment. We talk about it through the lens that every space that you enter is an environment. Every place that you inhabit is your environment. The skin color that you have is an environment. The way, like everything is an environment. And so how we respond to that and how we respond and how we build on climate justice and environmental justice has to reflect that. And that being said, like militarism and like, that is just one critical part of this mess. But like on the note that everything is interconnected, like I'm 19 years old. Like I grew up post 9/11. Like, I don't know in America or any part of the world actually before war. I don't know that. I don't know what that looks like. I grew up like people not trusting people, like mile long waits at TSA, like high security everywhere, like a super surveillance state. Like that's what I grew up in. And so like that has shaped like the way that I look at the world and the way that I organize. And like I came to my like I kind of just started to begin to realize that like what we are experiencing here in the United States, what we're experiencing in, like, I'm from Ethiopia. I wasn't born in the United States. I moved here when I was young. Like what my family is facing in Ethiopia, like Black people here are facing that at the same time. What Black people in Africa are facing right now, Black people in Latin America and Southern America, in like Southern America, you guys know what I'm trying to say. We all face the same exact things because we are all living like in the remnants and in like the machine of like several systems working together. And so like that's kind of what we're going to be going into, but like all of this is interconnected and we're going to break that down. But it's like what I'm experiencing here, my people are experiencing there, and their people are experiencing there. And the reasons for that is these systems work in tandem. Like the military works with the police works with the media. Like all of this is together, like everything is layered and connected.
Yeah, for sure. And I similarly am really grounded in a Black liberation framework, right? Like a lot of the work that I'm trying to do at PSN and in other spaces are about leading this work from a Black queer feminist lens. And when I think about that, and I think specifically about Black folks and other folks of color in the US, I'm married into a military family, right? Like all of my husband's mom's siblings got out of a really tiny town by joining the military, right? And so thinking about the way that the military has really great PR. My grandfather, I think, was one of, I mean, my mom is on the call right now, so I'm really nervous about mistelling this story. But from what I understand, my grandfather was the first Black person to use a GI Bill to build a house in South Carolina. There's a lot of really good, positive PR for the military and our families and our communities, because the military has been such an important pathway to get to the middle class. And it's hard and it makes me nervous in some ways to be like, nah, the military is not great, because it also was the first federal employer or national employer to integrate. So it's been a core part of our story, right? And even thinking about it in terms of like a longer historical trajectory, thinking about the Civil War even, right? Like the US military, the Union military is what won us our freedom. And also the military recruitment is really intentionally focusing on recruiting young, low-income Black and brown people to be on the front lines of these wars that are killing people. Like we're collateral in so many ways. And yeah, talking to Laura a couple of weeks ago, it distilled in my mind that we need to figure out alternatives to the military for thinking about economic upliftment. And Laura brilliantly spoke to the New Green Deal as an opportunity there. And I'm going to let you speak to that a little bit, because that was your wisdom and I don't want to steal your thunder.
Well, like all negative wisdom, I'm sure I stole it from somebody else. But yeah, I mean, I think that's such a critical point that Danny makes about sort of the promise and the opportunity that employment in the military brings a lot of people, and that's real, right? Like that's where this term poverty draft comes from. And what's messed up is that you shouldn't have to join the military. You shouldn't have to join an institution that's predicated on oppression, violence, genocide, like all sorts of terrible things, in order to have access to a living wage, in order to have access to health care. I mean, I have people in my life that, married into a military family so that they could get surgery that they needed to save their life, right? So things are real, and this is why we need something like a federal jobs guarantee. And that's one of the That's one of the tenets of the Green New Deal as it's been articulated by some. And, you know, some people think that something like a federal jobs guarantee is like pie in the sky, but we basically already have that through the military. The military right now is essentially the largest federal jobs program that we have in the United States, and there really isn't anything comparable to that. And how messed up is that? Like, why don't we allocate our resources in a way to create jobs and create community safety that's taking care of each other, that's taking care of the planet, not based off of, you know, militarism. So it's terrifying, but it also demonstrates that we can use that same framework to build something better.
Yeah, for sure. And when I think about militarization in our communities, I think that there's a really interesting link in thinking about the ways that infrastructure, like the pipelines, are becoming a hot zone for like militarized police forces, and we're also seeing those militarized police forces on the street in our communities when we're protesting in the streets around issues of police violence that are then again reinforced by the military through, you know, the surplus supplies that come into our communities, and also the funding from the police foundations that you spoke about, Laura. There's so many pieces there about the ways that the military is like coming home, I'm a millennial, and I think for myself and for people older than me and many people younger than me who haven't been involved in protesting and direct action have really thought about the military as being something that happens away, overseas, right? And we're really quickly seeing this coming home, especially in light of the fascism, right? And the fascism, honestly, I don't even know how else to say that is controlling the people of this country, limiting our free speech, and using really intense forces that they're getting from the military to control us. And it's happening. We saw it in Standing Rock. We're seeing laws coming in across the country around criminalizing dissent, whether that's talking about resisting a pipeline and like Indigenous folks and folks standing in solidarity with Indigenous folks who are defending their ancestral lands, to Black folks on the street who are saying, hey, please don't kill us. Like, just don't kill us. There's such a connection there. And I'm wondering, Elsa, if in your work you're seeing those connections in the street with other climate activists, what that looks like, and like how we could use that information to do better and go harder in terms of pushing for transformative change.
Could you repeat the first part of that? I missed the first part.
Yeah, so the first part is like, is this something that you're seeing in like your circles of folks that you organize with among your peers? And then also like, how can we use this information about increased militarization and criminalization of dissent in getting to the root and supporting transformative change?
Yeah, so everyone knows the uprisings have been happening all summer. They're still going on. Like, Philly is going up right now. DC is going up right now. And like, it was crazy. Like, this entire summer, like, all of my friends were dispersed across the country, and a lot of them are organizers. Like, they're in the trenches right now. And it was like, it was so scary because you wouldn't know what would happen. And it was like, on the street, Danny, you were just talking about like how we have militarized police on the street. We have military in the street. Like, let's not forget Portland. They were kidnapping people a month ago. They were kidnapping people, unmarked, like police tanks, military tanks. Like, that's been happening. Like that's been happening through this entire country's history. Like, my friends, like, for the first time ever, they're learning about like security protocol, like, while protesting, like making sure that their phones are not being tracked. Like right now in Nigeria, like all over Twitter, people are retweeting how to make sure your phone's not being tracked. Do this, da 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 da. And throughout this entire summer in the United States, like people were doing that here too. And then like having people on the street, I'm recalling this video that I saw. And Danny, you were talking about earlier how like the military uses our people to push its own agenda. Like they use Black people to push its own agenda. Like vulnerable, poor people that want healthcare, want education. We live in student loan crisis, like a student debt crisis. Like only America could have that. We're living through that, and people go to the military, one, to get education, two, to get funds, two, to get out of poverty, and like we rely on that. And the people that like they're using are our people to hurt our own people, whether they're here or abroad. In the video I saw, it was this Black man. He was military. He was guarding one of the protests, and he was chanting with the protesters under his breath, like, you can't dissent, like you can't leave the military, you're screwed for life, like you've signed your life away. And I was just thinking, like, in the middle of all of this, like they're using our own people against us to harm us, while like my friends, like if I don't hear back from my friends for like a few hours, I'm like, what the hell happened? Like, are you okay? Like, I remember in DC, like if I didn't hear back from my friend from a certain time, I was like, where is she? Because there are blackouts, media blackouts, cell phone blackouts. Like they had tanks in the streets. And so like, that's right now we're just fighting for environment. We're fighting for racial justice. We're asking for the police to not shoot us. And so that makes me think, if we want to tackle climate justice, if we want to tackle climate change, and then one of the main contributors to this crisis is the US military, how do you think we're going to be able to combat this crisis without like combating the United States military? How do you think we're going to be able to like get rid of this crisis without dealing with the US military and the police? We can't. And so I'm thinking, like, right now we're asking the police for not to shoot us. Like what we're seeing right now in the streets, what is that going to look like when we're directly challenging the systems that have gotten us into this moment? Because there's no other way out. And so I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, like, everything that happened in this uprising that's still going on right now, that's just what we've seen. That's the tip of the iceberg. Like, we're at the tip of the iceberg. We're just asking for simple things right now. But climate justice, that constitutes a restructuring of the way that we live, a restructuring of our economy, a restructuring of the way that we live in harmony with the planet, the way that we take from this planet, the way that we communicate with people, the way that, Danny, you were just saying the reason why we don't have so much in this country right now is not because we don't have it, it's because we don't have will. And it's because we're placing so much emphasis on other things. We invest trillions into the military, but we can't invest 1% of that into healthcare. We can't invest 1% of that into K through 12 education. We can't invest 1% of that into literally anything else. And so I'm wondering, like, if right now we're fighting for this, and down the road, and right now as climate change is like in our face and it's right here and it's getting closer and closer, I'm wondering, what is it going to take, and what is it going to look like for people that look like me, Indigenous people, disabled people, people who are at the crux of this crisis? What the hell is this going to look like down the road with the military down our throats?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think that a lot of folks have this feeling of, oh, it's not happening to me, right? And I think that climate change specifically is really horrific because all of the carbon emissions, not all, that's hyperbolic, but like there's such a disparity between the people who are feeling the impacts of climate change and the folks who are responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions. And so it makes it really easy, right? Climate change feels like something that's far away in so many ways. And it's just like, it's hard to think about and wrap your brain around, just like the fact that the people who are like losing their homes in the South Pacific are like largely people who are indigenous to that land, and whose people have been able to like live on that land and care for that land for like thousands of years. And yet those are the first people who are being displaced. And there's so many pieces of it, right? Like it's when we think about climate change, it's just like unfathomably complicated to think about all of the impacts across the continent of Africa. We're seeing so much like scarcity that's coming in because of like desertification, which is like caused by, in part, the deforestation that's happened that then reduces the amount of carbon that the trees are able to absorb, like transfer into oxygen, and also is just like intensified by the warming climate. And you know, Africa is the continent that contributes least to climate change, and also because of colonialism and imperialism, related to largely in the 21st century to a lot of the U.S. military's engagement on the continent, leaves folks wholly unprepared for resiliency and rebuilding, and building the infrastructure needed to be able to really thrive in this like changing planetary environment. And you know, over the past week, 2 weeks, we've seen a lot coming out of Nigeria, a lot of news coming out of Nigeria about SARS and about, you know, the police violence with that special agency, and seeing so many parallels between the US and US violence and the way that folks are being treated there. And I really think that that's really interesting, because Nigeria is the wealthiest country in Africa. It's one of the most wealthy countries in Africa, and it's one of the most wealthy countries in Africa because of oil. Right? So like there are just like all of these cycles and connections there, and like this police system that's existing in so many ways to protect capital, and in Nigeria that capital is specifically linked to oil. It's just I don't want to keep saying that it's like mind-bogglingly complicated, but I'm wondering what y'all's thoughts are about that, and how we can like connect these puzzle pieces to also then think about global solidarity and what that can look like in connecting this thread of US militarism and climate justice. That was a big one. I know. Laura, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can start. I'm just there's so much there. I'm trying to figure out what to grab onto first. But yeah, I mean, I think your point about Nigeria being rich because of its oil reserves is like really critical piece of that puzzle that I don't think has been acknowledged enough. And I was trying to find, I quoted on one of the slides a Nigerian activist, and the quote was, "Resource extracting corporations operate behind military shields." And that's certainly been the case around the world, including in Nigeria, where the fossil fuel industry there has been deeply linked to militarization and repression. And that goes back into thinking about the role that militarization has in upholding an extractive economy. Like, these economic systems don't make sense. Like, it's destroying the planet. It's terrible for people, except for this small percentage that's profiting off of them. And in many ways, it's terrible for them too, but keep it simple. And so you really need militarism to keep it going, because otherwise people are it doesn't make sense. People are going to resist that. And so it's really militarism and the violence of militarism that protects that economic system. And that goes back to what Elsa was saying about how we need complete, this vision for climate justice is for complete societal transformation. And that's why these sort of plans for climate justice that just sort of transition energy sources or just sort of change, the way we produce energy, for example, but keep all these paradigms in place are not effective. And that's why, what's so true, what Elsa was saying is we can't create this transformation without demilitarizing. It's just not possible. The militarization is so deeply embedded with these extractive practices, and the violence to the land and the violence against people are, one and the same in many ways.
Yeah, and I think that something that's really interesting there and is like an important like vocabulary word or framework is the military industrial complex, right? Like folks in movement spaces talk about the prison industrial complex all the time, and also talk about the nonprofit industrial complex, which like message me, we'll talk about it later. We don't need to get into it right now, but I think a lot about it. Both of those terms have like DNA rooted in language about the military industrial complex, which I think I'm remembering correctly is language that came from Eisenhower after World War II, when he expressed concern about a growing interest, private, corporate interest in the military, right? And he was concerned that corporate private interest was going to be able to lobby the government and inform decisions, like legislators' decisions about the ways in which we fund the military, the ways in which the military operates, and which wars we go to, right? And in both like talking about prison industrial complex and nonprofit industrial complex, there's like conversations about protecting corporate for-profit interests in industries that should have nothing to do with profit generation. And I think that it's important that folks understand that language around blank industrial complex comes from concerns from like the 50s about the military, and now we're seeing what that looks like. Most of the folks on the ground today, I'm pretty sure, in Iraq are military contractors, right? So like they work directly for-profit corporations like Deloitte and Lockheed Martin and other massive corporations that are literally invested in the military presence across the planet and protecting the interests of capital, money, in those places. And more often than not, that has to do with oil, right? And someone else said, precious minerals and like so many other resources from the ground that are also about our extractive economy and the way that we aren't living in harmony and in right relation with this planet. And that's what climate justice is about. Climate justice is about how we figure out how to sustainably live in right relation with the earth in a way that's sustainable and upholds human life. And that just doesn't jive with what the military does, and why it exists today. I feel like I should have a good follow-up question to that, but I'm curious.
Well, I have something to tack on to it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Back, I think thanks for bringing us military contractors, because that's so crucial for so many different reasons. I mean, it brings in a lot of different other movements into this conversation. So yeah, part of that is like corporate profits, and part of the reason that it's so hard to cut the military budget is because it's such a lucrative industry for so many powerful corporations. And so I showed that pie chart that showed that we have a over $700 billion Department of Defense budget, and nearly half of that budget goes to contractors every year. And so this is, it's a business opportunity, and there's a couple different aspects of that are important to think about. But one of them is sort of how, as people in the movement, when we think about, it can be unpopular, like Danny was sort of getting at before, to sort of bash on the military or to challenge the power of the military, because people want, there's this sort of patriotic notion of supporting our troops. But I mean, just look at that in and of itself. Over half of the entire military budget is going to corporations. Like, those aren't going to people's families. Those aren't going to troops. And we already sort of debunked that we should have other ways that those people that are getting their income should be getting those in other ways anyways. So that's an important thing to bring up. Also in the context of climate change and of fascism and of eco-fascism, another thing to sort of be aware of is that these big military corporations are very aware of the new business opportunities that exist with climate change. And, you know, they see climate change and climate chaos as presenting new business opportunities, right? Like it's the same old tricks, and they're going to find new ways to capitalize on the climate crisis. And that's something else that we need to be really vigilant of as people in the movement.
Yeah, for sure. Elsa, do you have any thoughts around that?
I was muted. I was saying, no, I think you guys covered it, but there's this quote I read a few days ago that really rung in my ear. And it's all our oppressors collaborate. And so right now someone commented, SARS were trained by UK military. Like US police forces trained in Israel with the IDF. Like these things go hand in hand. Like, I don't know how to like translate it, but like just looking at the relationship, just even that correlation between like the police and military and private interests, like all of these are one and the same. And so like this is a global struggle against like private interests and like the value of like property over anything else. And if like we're saying like ACAB, like that also translates to the military. Like the police that we have here in the United States, like the US military is the global police. Like we know that we are everywhere. We have over 800 military bases across the country, across the world. Like we are the police of the world. And so like, I don't know, man. It's just like, I'm just listening to everything you guys are saying, and it's like just ringing in my ear that like, these are just like, they're like twins, not identical twins, but they're twins. Like this is the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's also something really interesting that Leah's saying in the comments right now about like the positive PR that the military gets, right? And the ways that like academics and other folks are empowered and lifted up by the military, right? Like we've seen the military as a site of innovation for so many things, like GPS, which we all have on our phone, comes from like military technology. And a lot of that has to do with like the ways in which we are imagining progress, right? And the ways in which we are funding the military instead of academic institutions, and the objectives for progress and our visions for what progress looks like overall. I just wanted to like build that connection. Like I've heard people suggest to my husband, who's a chef, that he should apply to get military funding for like X, Y, or Z like chefy project. And I'm just like, no, how is this a thing? I don't understand. But like the military is so pervasive in so many spaces as like a good option or a good opportunity to partner with. And like, no, it's not ideal. We should have access to those resources through institutions that aren't founded on murder. And yeah,
I just one quick thing that's kind of an anecdote. It is so interesting, the really effective PR machine behind the U.S. military, which could be its own whole other conversation. But there is such a positive, or there tends to be such a positive public image of the military, but it doesn't take much peeking behind the curtain to like really see it how it is. And I had an experience earlier this year where I was looking up some data source on the Department of Defense website. And on the website, on some Department of Defense website, they had like a mission statement for the Department of Defense. And it was literally like #1 mission, lethality. And I was just like, of course, like to be lethal, to kill, like that is the mission of the military. But it's just like, they say it so plain, like it's is terrifying. And so I think, you know, the movement for Black Lives has done a lot of work in, you know, discourses around defunding the police and really challenging these notions in some communities that police keep communities safe. And I think that like Elsa was saying, can really be applied to the military as well, in these same sort of conversations around challenging notions of community safety, and also thinking about the massive resource drain that these institutions have and how better we could reallocate those resources. So this whole conversation about defunding the police could be applied to, you know, DHS, could be applied to the military. These are really parallel conversations, like Elsa said.
Yeah, for sure. Elsa, did you have any thoughts there?
Just one thing, Laura, when you were saying, like once you start tugging on the string, it all comes crashing down. And that reminded me that, like, if you're filming a movie in the United States or you're filming TV and you're including the military has to approve your scripts. They have to approve what you're gonna say. So like essentially you have to collaborate and partner with the military before you can produce any content if you want it to be mainstream. And so like thinking about how much effort, propaganda, and resources that we invest into like essentially the PR of the military, like investing in people's education, investing in people's families, investing in movies, like going into schools, like all of that is like a massive PR campaign that's ongoing since like our childhood. But really, once you start pulling at one string, like you question one thing one day and you start pulling that string and like it all comes undone, like everything. And I just thought that was really interesting because that's so true.
For sure. So we're about to close up this piece of our conversation and want to open the floor up for you to ask questions. You can either use the Q&A function on the Zoom or type your questions in. But Elsa, I think that there was something that you wanted to close out this conversation with around like global frameworks.
Yeah, 1 second. What about global framework? Sorry.
About solidarity.
Yeah. So, I mean, all you guys know, like right now, we're seeing climate crisis and it's here. But the thing is that, like, I don't think change is going to come from the United States, like on the scale that we need, because we are shielded from the realities of the military. We're shielded from the realities of climate change because we have been able to insulate ourselves. Like, our military can go anywhere on the earth and we can take resources as much as we want to and bring it back here, and we can use it at whatever rate we want. And at the same time, we can insulate ourselves from climate change a little bit. Eventually, like, it is killing us. But like compared to the rest of the world, like we are shielded from it. And so like it's going to be the rest of the world that's going to be like fighting like to save their lives. And like while we are having like our own movements and our own crisis here, like the crisis that's happening across the rest of the world, like that international solidarity, like that is like what's going to bring us out of this crisis. That's what's going to give us the framework to actually build something. And unless like we like cohesively respond, because like all our oppressors collaborate, all of these systems are intertwined. Like every topic we hit on today, like we could talk about like 50 other topics after it that are literally like almost identical. It's just a different face. And so like something as massive as climate change, which is honestly just a culmination of every injustice, every human choice, every system that we have allowed ourselves to live in, it's not going to be the United States. The United States is not going to save us. It's not going to be Europe that's saving us. It's going to be indigenous people from across the world that are doing the work, that have been doing the work of existing, of surviving. And so I don't like, change isn't coming from here, but change is coming from like the community and the solidarity that we build with everyone across the world. And like us like standing in solidarity with those people, because everything's happening at the same time. Like, we're all experiencing different facets of the same thing, if we're being honest.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. Laura, was there anything else that you wanted to offer or contribute before we start heading into the questions? There's a really juicy one that I'm eager to get to.
Oh, wow. Okay. No, I mean, I think Elsa said it beautifully, and I just want to, wholeheartedly agree for the need for global solidarity. And I think a really critical part of that is that, the U.S. is responsible for a quarter of all historic greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. owes reparations to countries around the world that have been impacted by the climate crisis but did nothing to cause it. And that's one great budget trade-off we could be spending our money on instead of militarism.
Truth. So it's funny because both of these questions are related to the economy. The first one I'm going to go with is there a way to transform these harmful institutions without dismantling our entire capitalist society?
Wait, what will you say one more time? It cut out for me.
Is there a way to transform these harmful institutions without dismantling our entire capitalist society?
That's a hard question. That's something I'm struggling with myself, actually. I don't know. If we look at the root of these problems, like, we know what the truth is, and it's, you have a 6-inch cut in your hand. You can't fix it with a Band-Aid. You have to stitch it up. Like, we can't have these systems if we want something new. And I'm trying to see like what exactly that looks like, what we can take that's already working and what we can implement new, or if that means an entire new system. I just know that the foundations of which we're building on right now, like, that's got to go. I don't know if that's an entire removal, but it's an entire transformation.
For sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm going to put a link to this Just Transition zine that Just Transition framework that I showed before is a part of. And like, I guess letting you in on like a little secret, like the extractive economy is capitalism and the living economy is not. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that something that I've realized over the past year or more maybe is that we don't have shared definitions, right, for what capitalism means and what socialism means or what communism means. I know that as US Americans who have been brainwashed, maybe, I don't know if that's the kind word, but the way that we've learned, especially after the Red Scare, about what socialism and what communism are. And it's also related to the military, right? Like, the military has been such a tool to reduce communism globally that it's hard to have a conversation about it, right? Because what we're living in now isn't free market capitalism. There's so many subsidies. Bernie Sanders talks about how we're living in a corporate socialist reality. I think that I could talk about this for days. But I want to point out that there are a lot of programs that really serve as important safety nets for our country, things like Social Security, things like Medicaid, that are really shining stars of like what it looks like to care for one another, regardless of how successful they are. The effort is there. And those are inherently socialist programs, right? So just to offer a contribution to this conversation that I hope that we can like grow more intentionally over the next year or more in various movement spaces, is I think of capitalism, when I define capitalism, it's maximizing profit and understanding the pursuit of profit as being the ultimate goal. So profit becomes moralized over other human and like environmental needs. And in that case, using that definition, understanding that the US is already not like a pure capitalist society, I think absolutely not. There's no way to save a capitalist system without transforming transforming these institutions without transforming and like getting rid of our capitalist society. I'm going to take a peek at the chat, see if there are any questions there. I would love to encourage you to ask questions. There's another one in here. How are municipal oil and gas sales related to paying for public safety, where police are considered the public policy of last resort? How can we break from this conception of taxes for social control to social investment? And I can put that in the chat for panelists. Ask more questions, y'all.
I think what this question is getting at is, just sort of this concept that certain communities are completely reliant on certain harmful industries for their tax base, and this tax base is what funds schools and other social issues, or other social programs, as lacking as they may be in many parts of the United States. And I think that's a great question, because we see a lot of parallels between the way that functions with the fossil fuel industry and then also with the military industrial complex. So there's, entire communities that are, that maybe they have a big defense contractor in their community, or there's some other tie to the military industrial complex that really makes sort of moving away from those industries really not popular. And so that's a good point to bring up and think about as we're strategizing how we take these industries down. But I think the key to this is recognizing that none of these institutions are like good investments, and there's actually other ways that we could be investing our money in other forms of work that are better for each other and are actually just a lot better investments. One way to think about this specifically as it relates to the military is that there's sort of this conception that like the military is a great job creator, or like, there's like the wartime economy concept, which is like in times of war, we have like a great economy. And it sort of gives this false conception that like spending money on the military is a great way to create jobs. And it's just not true. I'll find a study and put it in the chat, but if you look at the data, investments in the military are not actually a good return on jobs, and the same amount of investment for care work, like teaching or social work, this type of work that would take care of each other versus murder other people, or even work in renewable energy or energy efficiency. These are all much greater job creators. So there are other alternatives to, even though there are communities that are certainly reliant on these harmful industries, if we're sort of thoughtful about how we can transition those communities and account for that economic reliance, there are alternatives that are actually better in the long run.
Awesome. Should I move on to the next question? What roles or actions are you seeing women with an X, Indigenous communities, and other groups who are often left out of decision-making spaces take on to call to the destructive and extractive nature of militarism, especially in relation to the climate crisis? I love that question. I'm gonna paste it. Sorry, I should have pasted it first. Seems like we have a panel of visual learners here. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are big pieces there. I think that political education and building a shared analysis and vision are really important, right? Like I think that it's critical that we're able to articulate a vision for a better world that folks can buy into. And I think that that's labor, right? That's community building, that's coming together, that's deep personal work and relationship building. And then in terms of like, and I like those, that labor is power building. I deeply believe that that labor is power building. And I think that there are a lot of ways, like a lot of approaches. And part of the reason why I love PSN is that we have, 90 different organizations, 90 plus organizations who all see what we do as slightly different. I think that it's really important that we have a lot of people doing a lot of different things. And that's really essential part to my personal theory of change. I think that if I was talking to somebody, especially a young person, to try to figure out what that looks like, I would really encourage them to join an organization, to find like a political home doing work that resonates with them. If we're talking about like what kind of strategies or tactics feel personally most impactful, which is a legit question, I really deeply believe in building dual power, like personally. I think that it's really important that we build ways of modeling what the world we want to live in looks like and creating frameworks, especially now in the era of COVID, around what solidarity and mutual aid look like, and building the world, right? Like building the plane as we're flying it, building the world that we want to see as we're fighting for it. I also think that solidarity work is critical, right? Like show up in the streets to build power, to build any kind of power for any folks who are committed to seeing and upholding humanity. That could be going to migration, like immigration marches. That could look like showing up to Black Lives Matter or reproductive justice marches. There's so many things that are happening. And I think that like showing up with your body as much as you're able, to show people that we're willing and able to show up and be present physically for the things that we deeply believe in is really important. That's my opinion. Y'all are different humans. I'm sure you have different opinions. You can agree with me and also add things too.
I just feel like you just said it all so beautifully. I don't want to like even try to follow that, but yeah, I just really like this point that you make about the ways that just this point about care and the ways that we're sort of modeling that. And I think obviously like care is the opposite of militarism. And yeah, I just really I like that nugget that you put in there.
Awesome. Yeah, Danny, you literally said everything perfectly. I have nothing to add.
Okay, great. I'll take it. How can we communicate to our communities that U.S. military/police interests directly cause the climate crisis? That's a really wonderful question. Thank you for asking it.
That's a hard question. It's really hard to do. It really is. Personally, for me, it was just like seeing the impact that it has here in the United States. Like we live in like, if this was 10, 15 years ago, obviously I'm Gen Z, I use my phone, I'm on the Twitter, I'm on Instagram all the time. And so like during the uprisings and everything, one thing I noticed was there was a major gap in the information that our parents had and the information that we had. Like in real time, we were able to see the police on the streets. In real time, we're able to see people disappear. In real time, we're able to see like things that should not have been happening, while like our parents are shielded from it because they're not on these apps where you get instant information. Their information is trickled down. It's filtered through like media and stuff, and wherever they get their information. And so like one thing that has radicalized a lot of people that are in my age group is the fact that we can see this in current time. I can go on Instagram Live right now and I can watch 4 people lead a demonstration to the governor's mansion or something. And so like there's not like I can remember like almost 5 years ago when there were like protests happening all over Houston. I forgot like what they were protesting, but I was watching it in the middle of the night, and I was watching kids like college age being arrested by the police for protesting outside of the governor's mansion, like kids being like shackled up, and that like stuck with me like forever. And like that's when I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And so there, personally, I think like really showing people like there's nothing like proof to like change your mind. You can read about it, but when you see it and you see it happening to people that look like you, that could be like you, when you see it happening to people across the street, across town, like that wakes you up.
I think that I would also add that there are really clear connections between fossil fuel infrastructure and the military protecting that infrastructure, right? Like we talk about how we went to war in Iraq, and like that's always been like a key part of anti-war messaging for my generation, right? About the war for oil and how that was unjust. And we've always known that the climate crisis was on the horizon. It's so much closer and so much more horrifying today. But that consciousness has always been there. I was stunned at the last presidential debate that one of the people on the stage said something like in the answer to the climate change question. He said, we've gone to war for oil. And I've never heard a politician say that so explicitly. It's coming to the forefront. It's becoming somehow okay, but like that messaging is coming from the government, right? From the like conversations about accessing the highest office in the land, quote unquote. It's really there. Those connections are like less and less hidden, and we would not be nearly as dependent on oil today if there wasn't such an investment in the military industrial complex as like an undergirder for our entire economy. And we need to free our economy from those systems. And I feel like that really relates to another one of these questions, Laura, in case there's anything else that you wanted to add about Citizens United, basically. Some called to add congressional to the military industrial complex. So I guess congressional industrial complex. Did we lose a lot of control over our elections and representatives because of Citizens United? Could attacking laws that put corporate money into politics reduce the effectiveness in MICC, military industrial complex? Is that what that is?
Yeah.
Lobby.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer that, and then I have just one nugget for the last question too. But yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, that's sort of what Danny has been getting at when she's been bringing up the military-industrial complex in terms of like there's a lot of corporate power behind the military's dominance, and certainly chipping away at laws that are protecting corporate interests, like Citizens United, is a powerful tool in toppling that dominance. So I think certainly question asker is onto something there. I think also this previous question about how do you convince your community kind of depends on who your community is, and there's so many different really clear connections between militarism and the climate crisis. I'm not trying to like be a shameless self-promoter, but I am going to put another resource in the chat. So we put out this report that sort of outlines, it sort of expands on a lot of the components of the presentation I gave at the beginning. And I think these are all sort of different intersections between climate change and militarism. And depending on what kind of community you're a part of or what kind of community you're trying to persuade or convince, some of these arguments are going to be more persuasive than others. But there's a lot of different overlaps, and I'm pretty confident there's something that's going to appeal to whatever community that you're a part of, whether it's jobs or whether it's this question about wars for oil or whether it's about international solidarity. I mean, there's so many different intersections that you just kind of have to figure out where the right place to start is and go from there.
So I think we've got what's going to be our last question. In the 30s and 40s, the Works Program Administration hired unemployed people to build the US infrastructure, which demonstrates the feasibility of a federal jobs guarantee. Why do you think there's such resistance to convert military jobs to civil servant jobs and offering those same jobs to the public? I didn't paste it. I should have pasted it. Give me a second.
No, that's okay. I think I get it. I mean, I think there's a lot of different interests at play here. I think a part of it is the power of the corporate interests that are part of the military industrial complex. Part of it is like US imperialism and those types of motivations. So some of it's political, and it has to do with political projects towards US empire. Sorry to drop like a lot of jargony words on you, but I think you get the picture. There's a lot of forces and power tied up in maintaining the military status quo. Not to be discouraging, we can still topple it, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, everything she said. And once we start like giving people jobs, what else are they going to ask for? What else are people going to ask for once you give them a job? Education, a livable wage, housing, like safe community. Like once you start giving people one thing and you start expanding our definition of what the government is supposed to be doing for us, what we are entitled to from the government, then you start questioning, okay, then why don't we have this and why don't we have that? And we can't have that.
Also, you're so smart. You're just so brilliant, and I appreciate you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's about preserving the status quo and like maintaining people as like, I'm sure that the prison industrial complex has like a lot of money invested in making sure that people don't have access to jobs that will be able to support and undergird like a like socially acceptable lifestyle that wouldn't direct somebody to prisons. It's kind of too scary. That's the last question that we had. Elsa and Laura, thank you so much for helping us make this possible. Akila, if you're back there in internet land, can you pull up some slides about how folks can stay connected and support our work? If not, I can do it. Are you there? Yes, look at that. Technology, great. So PowerShift Network is organizing a massive convergence where we're going to bring together thousands of young people to have conversations like this and offer opportunities for building a political framework and building skills to be able to do activism better. I'd love to invite folks on this call to consider donating $5 a month, just $5, to PowerShift Network to help us make this happen. We're currently paying out over $15,000 a month to young folks who are helping with recruitment and all other sorts of pieces of pulling this together. So money is helpful. $5 a month. We're trying to build a people-powered movement that is not beholden to foundation support, because a lot of foundation support comes from corporations. Follow Generation Green, get updates from them. They're super dope. I stan Gen Green. And also give them money. Give everyone money if you have it, because the movement needs it. And these are hard times for nonprofits. And finally, please support Laura's work and work like it at National Priorities Project. Sign up for updates, keep in the loop. And give money if you got it. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? And we have more webinars coming up. I'm so excited about this project. We're really working on digging deep into these issues and helping make sure that young climate activists have resources to be able to be better allies, co-conspirators, and work in solidarity with various movements. On November 9th, we're going to have a conversation about immigration and climate justice. Details on who the guests are going to be is coming out next week. It's a really good group of folks. And then in December, we're having a conversation about white nationalism, which is going to dig into opportunities to learn about eco-fascism. I'm hoping to get a good answer on what the hell QAnon is. It's going to be a lot of good learning there. And let me know if you have any like ideas or connections about future conversations that we could have to help us build bridges across our movements to make sure that we are operating in solidarity, building power, and working to change this hellscape that is the US and beyond in 2020. Thanks so much, y'all. I appreciate you all. I hope you have a fantastic night and that you take care of yourselves as best you can. And folks that you love, we will be in touch with other details, some resources, and I appreciate you being here. Have a really great evening. Peace.